part of the PM20 fraction. Also, Icelandic dust show low degree of chemical weathering, with chemical index of alteration below 50. The mineralogical analysis show that Icelandic dust is very different from typical low-latitude dust, including, for example, Northern African and Asian dust. In Icelandic dust, primary components are amorphous material, plagioclase, and pyroxene, while in Northern African and Asian dust, primary components are quartz and clay. In Icelandic dust, the amorphous material vary from 60 to 90%. In only one sample, which is from the Hagvatn Desert in western central Iceland, the fraction of amorphous material was around 10%. This is because at this hotspot, sediments are supplied by the glacial erosion of lava flows, but for all the other hotspots, sediments are supplied by the glacial erosion of Yellowcrestite. This is a very glassy deposit, which is due to the interaction of water and magma. Another important feature in Icelandic dust is the presence of magnetite, which vary from 1 to 2%. In Northern African dust, magnetite is generally below 0.1% or not detected, and in Asian dust is generally below 0.8%. Also, Icelandic dust show very similar composition to the soil fraction, and this is very different from low-latitude dust, where mineralogical fractionation is generally observed at the emission. This bar chart shows the iron mineralogy in Icelandic dust determined through sequential extraction of iron as amorphous iron Fe, hematite and goethite Fed, and magnetite Fem. Other iron can include, for example, pyroxene or the amorphous material. In Icelandic dust, the total iron content varies from 10 to 13%, which is relatively higher than in Northern African dust. Also, Icelandic dust shows higher magnetite and lower amorphous iron and hematite and goethite content compared to the Northern African samples. The iron fractional solubility determined in ammonium acetate at pH 4.7 vary from 0.08 to 0.6% in Icelandic dust, which is comparable to that reported for Saharan dust. On the other hand, the iron solubility at pH 2 vary from 13 to 30%, which is higher than that observed in Saharan dust. There is a very limited knowledge on the optical property of Icelandic dust, and this has prevented an accurate assessment of its impact on climate. The imaginary part of the complex refractive index is representative for absorption, and a recent study has reported the imaginary index of volcanic dust from the Myrdalsandur Desert, which is in southern Iceland, and the imaginary index estimated at 647 nanometer was 0.01, which is around 1 order of magnitude higher than the imaginary index estimated for Northern African and Eastern Asian dust, and in the table is shown a reference value as 660 nanometer. So here in this study, we calculated the volume average complex refractive index of Icelandic dust, which is based on its mineralogical composition. And these vary from 0.002 to 0.006. And yeah, these values are a little bit lower than the value reported by Zupko, but still higher than the imaginary index estimated for Northern African Sahara and Eastern Asia, but comparable to the imaginary index reported for the Sahel region. But overall, this suggests that the absorption property of Icelandic dust may be higher than that of low-latitude dust in the solar spectrum. The complex refractive index of Icelandic dust was also retrieved using the online measurement of the size distribution and spectral Mie coefficient, which were conducted during the campaign at CISAM. The imaginary index retrieved using the online measurement vary from 0.002 to 0.004. Also in this case, these values are a little bit lower than the imaginary index estimated by Zupko et al., but these are comparable to the volume average imaginary index estimated using the chemical composition. And in summary, our research shows that Icelandic dust is very different from low-latitude dust in terms of both chemical and optical properties. Icelandic dust has basaltic composition and its primary components are amorphous material, plagioclase, and pyroxene. Magnetite is relatively high, from 1 to 2% of the total dust mass. Also, Icelandic dust shows low degree of chemical weathering, with low hematite, goethite, and amorphous iron content. Icelandic dust is also a source of dissolved iron to the North Atlantic Ocean, and magnetite is the main iron oxide mineral in Icelandic dust. Iron oxide mineral control the absorption properties of dust aerosol in the solar spectrum. This suggests that magnetite is likely the key factor contributing to the shortwave absorption properties of Icelandic dust. Finally, we show that the imaginary index of Icelandic dust, estimated based on its mineralogical composition, was consistent with the imaginary index retrieved based on offline measurement of its size distribution and spectral optical parameters. This both indicate that the absorption properties of Icelandic dust may be higher than that of low-latitude dust in the solar spectrum. This suggests a potentially significant impact of Icelandic dust on the radiation balance in subpolar and polar regions. This is the end. Many thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any question. And these are my contact details.
Thank you very much, Clarissa. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question for Clarissa. Okay, I have a question, Clarissa. When you're reporting these values of from the chamber, it was for PM10, for PM20. What?
It's for PM20 because CSAM collects around PM20. So from the paper of Claudia, yeah, I think those refer to PM20.
And you, I guess you use the same kind of resuspension method that you use for Northern Africa, right?
Yeah. In fact, actually, so this is like preliminary data. We still need to do some adjustment, but the size distribution that we observed is very similar to the size distribution of the dust of low latitude dust from Claudia experiment. So they are comparable.
Okay, there's a question by Claire here asking if there are other high latitude dust sources besides Iceland likely to be as absorbing as Icelandic dust.
Yeah, I think they can be, because the difference is between high latitude dust and low latitude dust. I think is the weathering process. So in low latitude dust, you have the chemical weathering can strongly influence the the formation of iron oxide, while in high latitude dust is mostly mechanical weathering, so the composition of the dust is likely to be closer to the composition of the parent soil, of the parent sediment. And so if you think about Iceland, we are looking into mainly basaltic deposit with very high iron content, and the primary mineral, iron oxide mineral, magnetite, and then you have also hematite, like primary mineral in the soil. In other sample, for example, in Svalbard or in Greenland, you have metamorphic deposits. And again, you're going to find mainly magnetite and hematite in this kind of deposit. like while in low latitude dust you have of course hematite, you have but you have a lot of goethite. In fact, like goethite in the low latitude samples, goethite tend to be the dominant phase among the iron oxide mineral.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
I think, Claire, do we have more time for questions? Because it's 20 minutes on the, it's up to 2:50, so I guess we can continue, right?
Yeah, I think let's continue.
Yep.
Thank you for a great talk.
Clarissa, does anybody have more questions? Because I think I have many. So like, please go ahead. Otherwise, I would monopolize the time.
Just one thing about the volcanic ash. So I think I saw somebody wrote about the reference, some references for the refractive index of volcanic ash. I think we need to distinguish volcanic ash and volcanic dust, because volcanic dust are, of course, they come from volcanic ash, because these are the volcanic ash form deposit sediments, but then these are eroded, transported, and manipulated by glacier, and then resuspended by the wind. So the composition, the size distribution, especially the size distribution, is going to be very different from volcanic ash. Actually, the refractive index, the imaginary index of volcanic ash, is very variable. It's like I made like a little review of all the index estimated from this volcanic ash from Iceland, and it varies from 0.0001 to 0.02. It's like several order of magnitude difference. And I think this is because different kind of eruption, and it can be also different kind of composition, because in some Icelandic volcano you have a higher silica content. So it can be so many factors, and we need to distinguish volcanic ash and volcanic dust. So and in this case I mainly focus on the volcanic dust and the comparison with the mineral dust. Yeah, I want to highlight this thing.
Okay, thanks. So Zongbo is saying that to Claire, that Conrad work did suggest that Svalbard dust is likely to be more absorbing. And as Clarissa said, we can hypothesize that they are more absorbing considering their mineralogy, but we need to make more measurements, of course. Okay. And then there's another comment. What are your comments from your results on the links between chemical composition and optical properties? From Susan.
So unfortunately, using only the Icelandic dust, I can't say anything because the composition is so similar. I can do a correlation, but when I have the final data, I will like try to make a correlation like with the content, iron oxide content in Icelandic dust and in mineral dust from low latitudes, because seriously, magnetite is a very the magnetite content is very similar in all the samples. So, yeah.
And do you think that magnetite is driving the optical properties, like more than others? Yeah.
I think so, because it is like is the main iron oxide. We found that is main iron oxide among the samples. So, at least in the shortwave spectrum, it is likely to be the case. But actually, we found a very interesting features that still needs to be confirmed. Like the Icelandic dust show a little bit higher imaginary index at around 900 nanometer. It should be the absorption of the pyroxene, because pyroxene is absorbing at the wavelength. So, but this is still need to be the final results.
Sure. Yeah. Excellent. So yeah, I think we don't have more questions, and it's almost 2:50. So thank you very much for your excellent work. So we are really looking forward for your paper.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go. So let's go to the next speaker. Bye. Thank you. Let's go to the next speaker, who is Lise Deschutter. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing correctly. And it's about optical properties of Gobi dust and its pure compounds, experimental extinction spectra, and complex refractive indices determination. So Lise, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lise Deschutter, and I'm working at Lille University, and I will present my work about optical properties of Gobi dust and its pure compound. And this work has been done at the PC2A laboratory and in the LOA laboratory. So first, let's focus about the optical properties of aerosol. So the atmosphere can be recorded using remote sensing and especially from satellite observation. With onboard spectrometer on satellite, it's possible to record gas and aerosol at the same time over a global scale. An example here, where we have a spectrum with the clear sky and a spectrum with the aerosol contribution. So there is a difference. So it could be nice that from this information, we can have the size of the particle, its concentration, and its chemical composition. But for that, we need an important physical parameter, which is the complex refractive index. Once we have this parameter, it could be possible to identify the different sources of aerosol over the globe and understand the transport of the aerosol and maybe get more information about how the chemical composition evolves during transport. So first we have to determine the complex refractive index. So there is two ways. First, we directly determine the Cree of the sample, and this methodology has been already done in our team. We use a sample like collected sample or commercialized sample. We don't need any information about the chemical composition, but it only provides the refractive index of one specific sample, which is not giving a global information of the natural sample. The other way is to use effective medium approximation. It says that complex refractive index of a mixture can be calculated based on the complex refractive index of pure compound and their volume fraction inside the mixture. But in that case, we need to know the refractive index of the pure compound and their volume fraction in the natural sample. But in the literature, there is still limitation about the database of the refractive index of pure compound. They are often done with a low spectral resolution with a narrow spectral range or only a specific spectral range, and on bulk material or press pellet, which is not representative to particle in suspension. So in our team, we will combine both of these ways. So first, we will directly determine the refractive index of our case study sample and its pure compound, and we will test some mixing rule of the Cree of the pure compound and compare it with the refractive index we obtain here on our case study sample. So let's have a look about the methodology. So first, we generate the aerosol. So the aerosol as a powder is in a reactor put back in suspension using magnetic steering and a nitrogen flow. Then we will characterize the aerosol using spectrometers to get extinction spectra over infrared and UV visible range, which is important to interpret the satellite recording. And we will also measure the size distribution and apply then an inversion algorithm using Mi-Theory, continuous distribution of ellipsoid approach when it's necessary, the case for non-clay material, the Kramers-Kronig relation, and an optimal estimation method to get at the end the refractive index at each wave number. Let's see about the experimental setup. So we retrieve here the generation of the aerosol, we retrieve here the characterization of the aerosol. So it's combining a Fourier transform spectrometers with a UV visible spectrometers, which allows to have a spectral range from 650 centimeters minus 1 to 40,000 centimeters minus 1, with a resolution which could go until 0.5 centimeters minus 1, which correspond to the one that Yazi spectrometers use to record the atmosphere. And at the end, we have a size distribution measurement combining APS with SMPS to get a wide diameter range. Now, we will explain why we had to use an inversion process. So at the beginning, the input is the extension spectra. So we can get from the extension spectra, we can get the extension coefficient, and this extension coefficient can be also calculated using mean theory. So it will be then possible to isolate the Cree of the compound, but if you remember, the Cree has two parameters, the real and the imaginary refractive index. So it's two unknowns and one equation. So we have a mathematical problem. So that's why we will apply an inversion algorithm. So as an input, we use experimental extinction spectra. First, a priori, we say that the extinction coefficient is equal to kappa, the imaginary part of the refractive index. Then using Kramer-Skroning, which express the real part as function as the imaginary part, we can get the real one, so n. So we have couple of n and kappa, and we can calculate with the mean theory and calculated extinction spectra. So we get extinction coefficient using this equation and the size distribution. And then we will optimize the couple n and kappa with minimization between the calculated extinction coefficient and the measured one, using an OEM, correcting the kappa, and after doing a loop until the minimization is done, and at the end we retrieve the refractive index. So let's focus about our case study. So our case study is mineral dust from Gobi Desert. So why we choose mineral dust? Because mineral dust is one of the major sources of aerosol in the atmosphere. And why Gobi? As you can see above, Gobi was really interesting because it has a complex chemical composition. So our sample is coming from the EMT, and as you can see, the chemical composition, we have halite, quartz, and calcite, which are the main pure compound inside Gobi. And we found also this in other work in literature. So next, we will apply the methodology I presented previously on Gobi and its three main compounds, halite, quartz, and calcite. So let's see some results. So first I will present the extinction spectra of the pure compound and Gobi. So here you have the extinction spectra, here the size distribution measured with the parameters. So here the infrared, the UV. In the infrared you can see the main absorption band, here corresponding to silicium oxide stretching and bending. And here you can see the diffusion slope. We have the same for quartz, but here it's different. We have a double peak. It's because quartz is a crystalline compound, non-clay material, and in that case there is ordinary and extraordinary that overlap, so that's why we see these double bond structures. Extension spectra of calcite. So here it's also a non-clay material which is crystalline also, but in that case the ordinary and extraordinary rays are separate, so we can distinctly see them. And here, if you can see in the diffusion slope, we have some harmonics corresponding to the main absorption band. This could be really interesting also to retrieve them in the complex refractive index and see them in Gobi. Why not? So here the Gobi extinction spectra, and then we will try to see if all these features correspond to the main three compounds. After the extinction spectra, applying the inversion algorithm, we apply the Cree of the pure compound. So here it's the case of halite. So we retrieve the refractive index over the whole spectral range. And as you can see, there is difference with the literature. And in that case, for halite, I had to combine three different works, three different set of N and kappa. And as you can see, for example, here in dot line and after here the black line, which is two different works in the literature, they are not homogeneous between them. Kramer's coding is not applicable. So here we give a new thanks to the literature that we have homogeneous complex refractive index over this whole spectral range. If we look now at quartz, we can find out again the same features, the double peak, the small peak here. For example, for you to know, in the literature, the refractiveness of quartz doesn't give these two peaks. So there's this one, but less resolved. We don't see the double peak. And this one is not seen because of the resolution. Here we have a better one, so we are able to see this small peak. And in the calcite, as we said, the harmonics, we can retrieve it at the end on the complex refractive index. And finally, the refractive index of Gobi. So we will check now if it's possible to explain the extinction spectra we saw before and this Cree of Gobi with the Cree and extinction of the pure compound. So let's first focus on the extinction spectra. So we will try to identify the pure compound. So here you have Gobi, the main one in gray. And here you have all the extinction spectra of the pure compound. So here you have the green one, which is highlight. So we can identify in Gobi highlight. We can identify calcite. And in that part, we can also identify quartz. We do a zoom, this double peak, and also again calcite with this peak. So it seems to work for the extinction spectra. Let's have a look on the complex refractive index. So I choose to only look at the imaginary part. So here we have Gobi again. And it seems also that we can explain also the kappa of Gobi with the different kappa of the pure compound. Also this feature of quartz, which is also here, and the double peak here. So it's possible to explain the optical properties of Gobi using the three main compounds we choose. But the only problem is that the spectrum I show you, it was normalized. So I modified the concentration or the intensity with an empirical factor in order to fit and to better see where the pure compound are fitting the features of Gobi. But it could be nice to now check with the real chemical composition and the real factor volumic fraction, for example, if it's possible to retrieve the refractive index of Gobi using these three main compounds. And for that, we will check some effective medium approximation. So there is a different one, which links the optical data with the chemical composition. So there is the volume mixing approximation, which calculates an effective Cree thanks to the Cree of the pure compound and their volumic fraction. But this one, we are not sure that it will be possible to apply it because actually we don't have separate particle of each pure compound, but mix of compound inside a particle. So that's why we'll try these two effective medium approximation. They are determining the dielectric constant of the sample. And here there is two different ones, so we will have to test. And this is depending on the microstructure of the sample, how the compound are dispersed in the sample. So we'll try later this. As a summary, so we said at the beginning that it was really important to get a new methodology to improve the refractive index database, to get better information for satellite observation. For that, we developed experimental setup on responded particle. We measure extinction spectra over a wide spectral range with high resolution. And we measure also at the same time the size distribution. Our algorithm is working. We retrieved the complex refractive index, and we had to use sometimes the CDE instead of me to retrieve the complex refractive index. And we apply that on Gobi dust and its three main compounds. And then we also saw that it's possible to explain the extinction spectra and the complex refractive index of Gobi using these three compounds. Some perspectives. So the question will be now, does this missing rule of complex refractive index present in the literature can be applied to natural samples? So we will apply this combination present in the literature and validate or not the principle, if it's possible to use this theory or not to retrieve refractive index of Gobi. Maybe we will need to get to know which rules to use. It will be maybe important to get more information about the chemical composition and the microstructure of the sample. And maybe use also the refractive index of other pure compound, because we use only the three main, but there is others, so maybe. And finally, the last question will be, could it be applied to satellite observation of Gobi particles during dust storm? So in another team, so that we are in partnership at the LOA, the PhD students use my extinction spectra of each pure compound in order to interpret the spectra of Gobi schistol from YASI data, and in order to follow the chemical composition of the dust, Gobi dust, as function of the position of the time during the dust storm. So it could be interesting to continue now with the refractive index and not only the extinction spectra. Thank you a lot for your attention, and I will be pleased to reply to some of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lise, for a very nice and very detailed talk there. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you have a question. Let's start with the chat. So Zongbo Shi asks, did you use the pulsed compressed air to generate dust? Did you try to use other methods to generate dust? And if so, did you get a similar size distribution?
Okay. So yes, we use, no, we don't use air, but we use nitrogen, but air was also possible. And we didn't use really pulse because it was a continuous flow of nitrogen. It's the magnetic stirring who creates the perturbation inside the sample and put back the particles suspension. But sometimes we had to do pulse in order to increase the concentration of particles in order to get more extinction in the infrared. And we never really try over generation for type to put back in suspension. We often have always the same size distribution. So for now, it's sufficient for what we need.
Okay, thanks. Carlos, did I see that you had your hand up, or did I imagine that?
I can raise it up. Yeah. Thank you very much, Lisa, for this incredible work and very much needed in the community. And I wanted to ask you if you plan to, because if I understand correctly, you're measuring individual mineral refractive indexes somehow.
Yes.
So are you planning to extend your list of minerals, and in particular, are you going to focus on goethite and hematite? As there's so much uncertainty in the literature with those index of refraction, it's kind of crazy. So what are your thoughts on that?
So yes, could be really nice to have the complex refractive index of each pure compound, of course, because we have to improve this. But for now, we choose this free one because it's explaining quite well the sample I choose, Gobi in that case. And maybe an extended sample will be more kaolinite. And hematite is also the one that we also talk about it. But yeah, it could be possible to continue on that. It's on, there is a postdoc working now on this, so there is possibility to continue on this also.
Yeah, I think there's high interest on that because basically it has been estimated that more than 90% of the of the direct forcing by dust is explained by iron oxide. So I mean, there's a clear need for that, and in fact, there are many communities that are. I know that some people want to. I mean, I'm telling you, from NASA, they are planning to try to measure that because all the refractive indexes, from the past, there's a lot of uncertainty and they need that for spectroscopy, and so there's high interest on this type of data. Just letting you know that your work is very relevant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I absolutely echo that. There's a few more questions in the chat. So from Dai Zhao Zhang, how did you collect the dust at the Gobi areas, and how did you choose the surface soil types?
Actually, the sample we get, I didn't collect it by myself. It was done by the EMT. Actually, the session of this morning we had it from Frédéric Thévenet. So actually, I don't have so much information on that. Sorry.
Okay, and maybe for a last question from Clarissa Baldo, would the fitting method work also for iron oxide at shorter wavelengths, kind of, I suppose, relating to Carlos's points?
I'm sure it could work for sure. And in the algorithm and the process, how the experimental setup can be applied, I'm sure, to different kind of sample. We choose the mineral dust, like Gobi dust, but I'm sure it can be applied to other sample. And at shorter wavelength, of course, also, because now I just choose this detector from the Fourier transform, but we could also use other detector to get at the beginning extinction spectra on the wavelength that we want at the beginning.
Okay, thank you very much. Really interesting talk and interesting work. So good luck with continuing that.
Thank you so much.
Showing us your results. I'd like to introduce the next presentation, which is by Khanneh Wadinga Fomba, who is going to be talking to us about phosphorus speciation in the Namib Desert. Have we got you, Khanneh?
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Khanneh Wadinga Fomba from the Leibniz Institute for Tropospheric Research in Leipzig, Germany. And today I would like to present to you data on the phosphorus speciation in Namib desert dust particles. Here I would like to acknowledge the funding from the German Research Foundation for providing the resources to carry out this project. So, why is phosphorus important? Phosphorus is a key nutrient for plants and phytoplanktons, especially in terrestrial and marine ecosystem. It is essential for the functional and structural components for the storage of information on routine functions for protein lipid synthesis and sugar metabolisms in plants. It promotes their early growth, winter hardiness, the formation of their seeds, and increases the water use efficiency of these plants. It also influences CO2 sequestration, carbon cycle, and the biological pump. Here is a picture of a maize plant that's suffering from phosphorus deficiency, and due to the low phosphorus, the color of the leaves change. Hence, phosphorus deficiency is it's very important. It's not very good for plants because they can actually lose the ability to carry out photosynthesis, which is very important for their growth. So phosphorus is very important for photosynthesis and for marine productivity. Phosphorus also has a very important role, not only for terrestrial, but also for marine planktons. Together with nitrogen, they are one of the main major nutrients for marine productivity. However, the optimum primary productivity requires a ratio between nitrogen and phosphorus of 16:1, according to Redfield. Hence, if there is a depletion of one of these measured nutrients, they can be low productivity, especially what we observe in oligotrophic regions, whereby either there is a depletion of phosphorus or nitrogen in the marine waters. In coastal waters, these nutrients are being supplied through erosion or through rivers input into the ocean. However, in the open oceans, where the river inputs are limited, atmospheric deposition plays an important role for providing these nutrients to these organisms. The amount of nutrient is important, the total amount of nutrients. So the total phosphorus in this case is important, but even much more necessary is to know the soluble and bioavailable phosphorus that is readily available for the planktons to carry out their metabolism. Most often, orthophosphates have been referred to as the most bioavailable forms of phosphorus, which are typically sourced from mineral dust. However, there have been studies that have shown that different phosphorus species or forms have different solubility, and at times, atmospheric processing can even play a significant role. However, acidification of the particle surfaces is not yet well investigated, and hence the role of atmospheric processing on phosphor solubility is not yet well known. According to Wadinga, there is not enough data to assess some of these hypotheses. As we see from the review of the data availability, there is a lot of data scarcity in the Southern African region. Most often the data available are from ship cruises in the Atlantic, and very few ground-based measurements are available wherewith we can actually perform long-term assessments of the variability mechanisms of transport and sources of phosphorus in the regions of the Atlantic south of the equator. Hence, we had moved forward to investigate the phosphorus speciation in mineral dust and marine aerosol particles within the DFG-funded FOSMA project, where we wanted to quantify the phosphorus and its seasonal trends in the region close to the southern eastern tropical Atlantic, identify its forms, sources, and deposition fluxes, and also elucidate on the role of atmospheric processing on the solubility of phosphorus made available in the southern eastern tropical Atlantic. So we had moved to the middle of the Namib Desert to the Copperbelt Research Institute, which is an ecological research center in the middle of the Namib Desert, where we collected aerosol particles using high volume digital sampler on quartz filters. We typically collected them on a routine on a 72 hours sampling routine for a period of 1 year. We quantified the phosphorus using different methods. So the total phosphorus was quantified through combustion at 550 and thereafter extraction 1 molar HCl. The analysis and the dictation of phosphorus was done using the standard molybdenum blue complex proposed by Aspila, and the phosphorus signal was quantified at 710 nanometers using a UV spectrometer as seen in the picture here. To enhance the sensitivity, we use a 1 meter liquid waveguide capillary cells to enhance the signal, the absorption signal of the complex. For the total inorganic phosphorus, we extracted the filters in 1 molar HCl without combustion, and for the soluble phosphorus, we extracted it in DI water and filtered through a 0.45 syringe filter. The total organic phosphorus was then derived as the difference between the total phosphorus and the total inorganic phosphorus. So what did we find? we found that the total phosphorus concentrations was quite variable throughout this year. We had frequent peaks in the phosphorus concentrations that were related to changing weather conditions in the location. The very high peaks were even were related to extreme weather conditions of mineral dust, and other peaks were related to periods of biomass burning. So what we observed was that the baseline of phosphorus was around 12 nanogram per cubic meter. However, the concentration ranges were quite interesting. The range between 2 and 230 nanograms per cubic meter, which is quite interesting for phosphorus, especially in this region. The average yearly mean was around 50.6 nanogram per cubic meter. And if we compare it to data published in the Atlantic for Saharan dust, it is about factor 10 higher than the data available during some ship cruises in the Atlantic. The seasonal trend showed high concentrations for January, February, March, and very low concentrations for May and June. Despite this low concentration, we also observed periods of high phosphorus concentrations relating to biomass burning episodes or enhanced strong winds leading to a resuspension of mineral dust from the desert. The time series of the various phosphorus forms, especially the total inorganic phosphorus, total organic phosphorus, and the soluble phosphorus, show strong temporal variation. The total inorganic phosphorus showed significant good correlation with the total phosphorus. Here, I show again the total phosphorus for comparison's sake. What we can see is that the peaks in the total inorganic phosphorus correspond to peaks in the total phosphorus. And this shows that the total inorganic phosphorus dominated the total phosphorus in this region. We can see also in the concentration range that about more than 80% of the total phosphorus was made of total inorganic phosphorus. But the organic phosphorus, the concentration range between 0.01, so 10 nanogram per cubic meter to about 70 nanogram per cubic meter. The range was similar to that of the soluble phosphorus. However, the peaks in the total organic phosphorus were observed mostly in the months of February, March, while the peaks in the soluble phosphorus were observed mostly in the months of July. So this shows very different seasonal trends of the different phosphorus forms, indicating that the various phosphorus forms may certainly have different sources or different processes propagating their presence. As a comparison to other studies relating to phosphorus concentrations in Saharan dust samples, we see that for the total phosphorus observed in this work and the total inorganic phosphorus observed in these studies, they are quite high compared to those reported for Saharan dust in different parts of the world. For instance, in Miami, the average concentrations were reported to be about 11.8, in the Atlantic, 5.6, and Cayman Island, 54. The total organic phosphorus was reported in some regions around 1.3, and the soluble phosphorus range is quite low for samples reported in different parts for the Saharan dust compared to the samples observed during the one-year studies in the Namib region. This tells us that most likely the mineral dust content in the Namib region has high phosphorus compared to the Saharan dust region. So we'll further look into how soluble and bioavailable these phosphorus are. Here is the time series of the solubility of phosphorus over the sampling time, and also the solubility of phosphorus plotted against the total PM10 mass. So what we found was a strong variation in the phosphorus solubility from 5 to 93%, with very high values between June, July, and at times during October and November. when we compared the solubility to the PM10 mass, we saw more inverse relationship, indicating that we had high solubility in phosphorus when the PM10 load was not too high. So when we looked at the influence of aerosol acidity, we found very interesting results. Here I've plotted the solubility against the total phosphorus, and the colorations are the pH values of each of the samples sampled during these various months. The pH range between 5.3 and 7.8, and we saw that during the months of March, April, May, there was a tendency, but not very strong correlation between the aerosol acidity and the solubility. However, for June, July, August, we started seeing a trend with lower aerosol acidity correlating to higher solubility. We also found the same trend for September, October, November, where we found a very strong correlation between aerosol acidity and solubility. So this is a plot when we plotted the solubility against the pH. We saw a strong linear regression with regression factor more than 8%. So this tells us that the aerosol pH controls the solubility in this region during certain periods of the year. Whenever the pH was less than 5.8, the solubility was greater than 40%, which is quite significant for phosphorus. We tried to find out if biomass burning was a factor affecting the solubility. So here is the solubility plotted against levoglucosan, which is a good tracer for biomass burning, and arabitol, which is also a good tracer for fungal spores from plant debris. As you can see, there is a good coincidence between periods of high levoglucosan in the particles and arabitol with periods of high phosphorus solubility. This indicates that the solubility of phosphorus could have been driven by particles coming from biomass burning episodes. So to check the sources of phosphorus, we compared the organic phosphorus to organic carbon ratio to evaluate the contribution of organic carbon on organic phosphorus. We also compared this again, the time series, to the levoglucosan and the elemental carbon data as proxies for combustion. And we also compared this to the ratio between organic phosphorus and calcium as a proxy for the contribution of mineral dust. As we can see, the peaks in the organic phosphorus were observed when we had peaks in the calcium content in the sample. This highlights that there is a strong contribution of organic phosphorus from those transporting biological materials, for instance, plant debris or bacteria. But there was little organic phosphorus contribution coming from combustion activities relating to biomass burn. We looked into the relationship of the inorganic phosphorus, especially to apatite mineral. So we plotted the total inorganic phosphorus again, non-seesaw calcium and fluoride, and we saw very good linear regressions. This indicates that the total inorganic phosphorus in the particles were dominated by the apatite mineral, which is known to be abundant in this region. So finally, we determined the deposition fluxes of nitrogen and phosphorus. As I said before, these are two major nutrients that can control bioproductivity in the ocean. The deposition flux of phosphorus varied between 0.1 and 2.5 micromole per square meter per day. And this is quite significant if we compare it to those values reported so far for the Atlantic, which lies below 1, which lies far below 1. The nitrogen to phosphorus ratio ranges between 4 and 256, but the monthly average stays typically above 20, implying that atmospheric deposition of nitrogen or nitrogen-containing aerosol particles can contribute to the reduction of the limitation of nitrogen in these regions and enhances the deposits of phosphorus. So with this, I hope I've been able to show you the first long-term measurements of phosphorus speciation in dynamic aerosol particles, which is representative of the contribution of mineral dust to the southern eastern tropical Atlantic, and that the solubility of phosphorus in this region depends on the acidity and is also influenced by biomass burning. We show that the biomass burning and mineral dust contributed to the compositions of the organic and the inorganic phosphorus, and that atmospheric deposition of nitrogen and phosphorus is high, indicating that the atmospheric deposition of particles in this region contains high amount of these nutrients and can prevent nitrogen limitation in the southern eastern tropical Atlantic. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention and happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Khanneh. Very, very nice presentation. Very nice data set and results. So do we have questions for Khanneh? Please raise your hands or write. Okay, we have here Zombo. So impressive data set. Not surprising that inorganic P is mainly apatite. So how the pH is calculated? Did you measure non-soluble calcium in water extracts? And if so, are they correlated to phosphate?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Zumbo. Yes, we actually measured the pH from water's soluble extracts. So we punched out the filters, extracted them in the eye water, and measured the pH of the extracts. So these were measured pHs of the samples, which we correlated with the solubility. And we also measured the non-seesaw calcium, which I showed the correlation with total inorganic phosphorus. And yes, there was a correlation, there was a good correlation with the phosphate, especially the total inorganic phosphorus. This was, however, seasonal. There were some seasons that we didn't find a very strong correlation, especially in the northern hemisphere winter. But during the periods of fall, for instance, and in late summer, there was a strong correlation between the non-seesaw calcium and the phosphate. That's why we attributed the contribution of the total inorganic phosphorus to be from the apatite mineral, which, as you said, is not quite surprising.
Okay, so question from Daizu Zhang. What are the relative ratios of its total phosphorus to total aerosol mass, particularly in dust samples, and how are they compared to results in other areas?
So to the total aerosol mass, I didn't estimate that ratio, but I think it was less than 2% somehow. And comparative to other regions, I did the first comparison just to the Saharan region, which I showed the ranges, that the ranges in the southern African region seems to be quite high compared to that of the Saharan non-phosphorus concentrations. So in some cases, I found factor 10, but I must admit that this is quite seasonal. This is quite temporal and seasonal, because the measurements with which I did the comparisons were mainly based on snapshots. And here we have a long-term time series of a year where seasonality plays a role. So there was significant, in general, the total phosphorus was higher in the Namib regions compared to the Saharan regions. To the Asian dust regions, I think there were some studies in Taiwan and so that had even higher phosphorus concentrations than what we found in the Namib desert dust. But I didn't make a strong comparison with all of them yet, but just to the Saharan dust reported so far.
There's a question again by Zombo, and I think we will have to. That will be the last one, right, Claire? Because otherwise we're a little bit late in time. So if aerosol pH indicates strong atmospheric processing, how do you explain the strong correlation with levglucosan, which may indicate a strong control of difference in phosphorus solubility from different sources?
Yeah, so we found this, as you could have seen, it's quite seasonal. There were some seasons that we had strong influence of biomass burning, which is labeled glucosan, and the pH in these seasons were not were also high, but did not show that very strong correlations. And then we had a season like in fall, where we had even stronger correlations with aerosol pH. And during fall, the biomass burning episode was quite low. So there is a combination of effects. One is the correlation with the pH. One is the sources of the dust. So both of them correlate to the high solubility we find.
Okay, thank you so much for the detailed explanations and your excellent work. We're gonna go for the next speaker now, who is Romain Ceolato, multispectral small angle light scattering by volcanic ash particles from Popocatépetl. Romain, is your turn. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Okay, thank you. I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation. So this is a very new work for us and a collaborative work between ONERA, the French Naval Space Lab, and the Puebla University in Mexico and Kansas State University. So we are trying to measure multispectral small angle light scattering by volcanic ashes from the Popocatépetl volcano. So as you know, volcano eruptions, we talked about those dust emission a lot this morning, are one of the major sources of stratospheric aerosols. And they have been, those eruptions have been reported and recorded in pre-Hispanic codex since 1509 as particles reaching the stars from this volcano. So this has been recorded and has been a concern for human beings living around for several years. And as regarding the impact of volcanic dust, there are several main impacts that we can mention. First, they can produce localized radiative forcing, and we are still investigating about the magnitude of this forcing. They are also a source of poor air quality for inhabitants living around the volcano, which is a major concern as we discussed this morning. And also, and that is more of a concern for us at the Aerospace Lab, about the significant hazards to civil aviation, causing dramatic engine failure, damage on the avionics systems, and also abrasion of several aircraft parts. So this will be one of the main concerns for us. So today, as we were discussing, there is a lot of interest to the detection and quantification of volcanic clouds, and this has been an active work for the optical remote sensing community. So as you know, the volcanic dust are the typical non-spherical particle, and although they have been modeled for different light scattering application using the Me theory, which is applicable for spherical particles, but this aerosol and the particles are strictly not spherical, and they present a large diversity of microphysical and chemical properties. In terms of composition, we know they are mainly composed of silicate glass, and also composed of several minerals. Their morphology is highly non-spherical, and they reflect the fragmentation mechanism of the eruption. In terms of particle size distribution, this is quite interesting for remote sensing. In fact, we we can distinguish different categories of particle sizes, from large to fine and to ultrafine particles, and those different sizes has different atmospheric residence from a few minutes to several days. And depending on the location of the measurements and also the type of measurements, we will address different particle sizes. So this must be taken into account for the analysis. On the right part, you can see some SEM, some electron microscope images of typical volcanic ashes from the Popocatépetl volcano that have been sampled nearby the volcano in Puebla city. So this is an example. My field is active optical remote sensing, and we have been using LiDARs for quantification of various aerosols in the atmosphere, including volcanic clouds. So this is an example of a Calliope LiDAR system that measured attenuated backscatter profile over Finland. And as you can see over here in white, this has been reported by papers, several papers that have mentioned this detection of volcanic clouds. There is a need for development of algorithms to detect and also quantify the microphysical products from the LiDAR signals. LiDAR is not a very direct and easy direct data to invert. So we need for detection to use what we call the color ratio, which is a ratio of different radiative properties at different wavelengths. For LiDAR, we use backscatter cross-sections. And for quantification, we need to invert the LiDAR equation, which is a typical problem for earpulse problems, such as LiDAR. So to do that, we typically use what we call the LiDAR ratio, or the extinction to backscatter ratio to solve the LiDAR equation, and then we can retrieve backscatter or extinction profile, and from those profiles we can extract mass or number concentration using the right optical model. So basically, when we measure LiDAR signals, we need to assume that we know the color ratio and the LiDAR ratio of the aerosol that we are detecting. So to do that, those color ratio and LiDAR ratio must be chosen from different databases that come from measurement from ground-based LiDAR and also from modeling. So there's been a lot of information in the scientific literature to gather all this information. And here we propose to improve this knowledge using laboratory measurement. You can find on the right some typical LiDAR ratio and color ratio, and you can see that depending on the measurement campaigns, depending on the publications, we can find a broad range of values for those coefficients. So there is an interest in developing new devices, lab devices, for measuring those spectral properties. So this is a typical arrangement that we developed in our lab with Kansas State University. We used a supercontinuum white laser to illuminate the particles. So I wonder, I think you can see my two mouse moving. So this would be the supercontinuum laser that is going through a monochromator for spectral selection. And the light beam is going through several mirrors until this part where a particle of volcanic ash is deposited on a glass window. And we collect over here in green the scattered light from the particle in a small angle region. And this is measured then by a CMOS sensor. So we use this simple device to probe the light scattering properties at different wavelengths. So to calibrate our device, because we use a matrix of pixels, we need to have every pixels of the matrix to have a correspondence between these pixels to coordinate angle, theta and phi angles. So we use a spherical aperture, and we use the well-known Airy diffraction patterns to make this correspondence and to have a calibration method. So this is working pretty well, and we can calibrate and correct different distortion that is induced by the optics. So once we have our setup calibrated for all the different wavelengths, we can probe and measure different aerosol deposited on the glass window. So those particles, you can see the different results. On the left, we have a spherical particle, and on the right, we have a volcanic ash. So you can see very fast that the images are very different. So from the multispectral patterns for spherical particles in dust, we have on the left hand spherical particles that produce a very symmetrical pattern, and a non-spherical particles that will produce an asymmetrical patterns. So in a qualitative way, we can easily detect spherical from non-spherical particles in a cloud, for example. So this was done in the lab, of course, but the idea is to link the scattering pattern with the morphology of the particle. So this has been done in the community for using small angle light scattering. What is new in our work is that we could probe those scattering patterns at different wavelengths. In this work, we used 14 wavelengths, different wavelengths, but we can extend it to 100 or a few hundreds of wavelengths, as much as we want, depending on the sensor and the laser, of course. Then we can select and pick some wavelengths and to produce those color images. So this is just an example of color-based analysis to illustrate the importance of spectral scattering, not only for sizing application, but also to extract some information about the material that is also linked to the refractive index that has a spectral dependence, as we've seen in a couple of talks before. The spectral determination and measurement of refractive index is a big concern in the atmospheric community, and yeah, I would say the scientific community, because there's a lot of application and interest in measuring the refractive index, several wavelengths. Another way is also to determine the particle asymmetry factor. This is a more quantitative way to, as you know, in atmospheric physics and science in general, when we encounter some particulate media that will scatter light from the sun or from the laser, in the case of LiDAR, we use the Mie theory for computing the different extinction or backscattering cross sections. And to do that, we are assuming that the aerosol are spherical. So we propose to use this kind of instrument to assess the validity of equivalent spherical models that most people are using for different aerosols. For instance, pollen can be, some types of pollens, it is reasonable to use a spherical model for them, but for volcanic ashes, as we've seen from the microscopy and we've seen also from the scattering patterns, it's very non-spherical particles producing a scattering pattern that is very different than the one predicted by Mie theory. So one can be concerned about the use of the Lorentz-Mie theory for assessing the different properties, radiative properties of volcanic ashes. So this would be a way for us, this is just an example for another volcanic ashes, but we would like to do it for several volcanic ashes to have a more representative asymmetric factor, but we could then have a quantitative way to estimate the error of this spherical assumption that we are usually doing using the Lorentz-Mie theory. And the concept is very simple. We need to partition the scattering patterns into n different segments, and then we average it to get a single number that is called the asymmetry factor, and this factor will be directly linked to the azimuthal asymmetry of the pattern. In this case, if we have a number higher than 10, this will quantify that we can estimate, or we can say that the particle can be considered as non-spherical. And in theory, we should not use the Mie theory to compute the refractive, the radiative properties for those particles. Another quantitative way to use the multispectral light scattering curves would be to use what we call the Q-space analysis. That's another way to represent the diagram as you saw the two-dimensional small angle light scattering patterns, but we can also represent them in this Q space analysis. The Q vector is the scattering wave vector that is given over here. So it's a very handy and very useful way to plot and to represent in a log-log scale the different light scattering curves. This has been introduced by Sorensen using this Q-space analysis for extracting power laws in order to identify the microphysics of the particle directly from the light scattering curves without using any sophisticated inversion methods. So this is a way to extract physical properties of the particle directly from the scattering curves. And as we can see, the first maxima aligns very well with the curves all over the wavelength. So this is expected, and this was predicted by the Mie theory, but it's also very nice to be able to reproduce it in the lab for a single spherical particle. And you will notice a power law that was found on the experiments Q exponent -3 is also found. This is a general feature for spherical particles. So this is also a way to quantify or to extract morphological information directly from the scattering patterns. And also something very interesting, if you notice, we have a change of scattering intensity. So this has been normalized by the maximum intensity, but we have some modification of the wavelengths. So this would be an indication of the refractive index and material information too. So we would like, from that, so this is a very recent results. So we would like to develop some inversion techniques to retrieve refractive index directly from those scattering patterns. Well, so this was just some recent results about our multispectral light scattering technique. It would give some very important considering the variability in the different LiDAR parameters that we are using, including LiDAR ratio or color ratio for volcanic dust. And the laboratory measurements are proposed to improve our knowledge of those spectral radiative properties in order to build databases. And we would like now to extend our techniques for backscattering in 180-degree measurements to improve the LiDAR inversion and classification method by measuring the backscattering cross-section directly in the lab. So this will be done on particles, different kinds of particles, spherical, and also volcanic caches in the next months. And using this database of multispectral and also polarimetric light scattering properties, we would like to infer the spectral refractive index of single particles. So this is a very interesting and complementary of other work that has been presented in the morning and later before this afternoon. So I'll be happy to discuss more with you and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Romain, for a very interesting presentation. If everybody would like to raise their hand if you've got a question or put your question in the chat box. Did I see one pop up there? No. Romain, you mentioned an extensive database of the scattering properties you've been describing. Are you planning to make that publicly available?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to make it.
Are you planning to make that database publicly available?
Well, that would be the idea, to first have the database validated using different models. And yes, the idea would be to make it available for people, especially working on volcanic caches. So we are also collecting and sampling different volcanic caches at different periods, like every month, because the Popocatépetl volcano has been active continuously. So we would like also to have some information about the change of scattering properties, but maybe also the refractive index over time, over 1 year eruption. to see if there is any cycle or any interesting properties in like temporal properties or changes of the scattering and refractive indexes.
Yeah, that sounds very useful. Any other questions?
Claire, I can ask just a curiosity. You were talking about ultrafine particles below 30 microns, which is kind of surprising to a certain part of the community. Is that an error, or it's just how you frame it for volcanic ash?
You mean the error bars on the graphs? Or?
No, you were in the introductory slides. You were showing the different ranges of interest for volcanic ash, and you were mentioning that ultrafine particles were below 30 microns.
Below 1 micron, that would be difficult with this device, but we would like to also investigate other kind of particles. Yes, we focused on volcanic ashes because this has been an interest for aviation and civil aviation recently and in the last 10 years, but we are interested in other particles, yes.
Okay, thank you, Romain. I think in the interest of time, we had better move to the next presentation. Thanks for your talk. So the next presenter will be Jessica Arnold, who will be telling us about active orientation control of optically trapped airborne microparticles.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jessica Arnold. I'm currently a NRC postdoctoral fellow working at the U.S. Army Research Lab. And first I'll talk about why we're interested in isolating single particles and manipulating them. So as was shown in a really nice pie chart earlier this morning, I think it was the second talk, we have all these different aerosol components in the atmosphere, and they can be from natural sources like sea salt or volcanic ash or desert dust, or you can have man-made sources from, say, fossil fuel burning or biomass burning. And so when we collect signals of the aerosols from remote sensing or in an instrument deployed in the field, you have all of this signal. And so if we would like to be able to identify specific components, there's a lot more work to do, right? And one way that we can help develop techniques to identify specific aerosols is by isolating single particles and then measuring their scattering properties directly. Another reason why it's interesting to study single particles is that aerosols have complex shapes and sizes, and they can be heterogeneous in their chemical composition. So what's shown here is an example of a droplet that has a different composition in the core than in the shell. And this is a figure from one of my co-authors, Amable Khanneh, who recently wrote a review paper. And what you see here is that the Raman spectra of the core, I think in red, is different than the shell. And another thing that you can do is then study the changes over time to the aerosol in different atmospheric conditions. So in this example, it's looking at how the Raman signal looks over time as the different components evaporate. And you can imagine that for a solid aerosol, which is more usually what I work on, you can have different parts of this complex shape having different components, and it would be really great if we could manipulate the particles so that we could measure the spectrum of specific targeted areas within the particle. Another technique was mainly what I'm interested in is looking at the 2D elastic scattering patterns, because that can tell us a bit about the morphology of the particles. And this is an example of a scattering pattern that I took in the lab of a Bacillus globuli bacterial spore, which is roughly spherical. And from what you can see, the scattering pattern looks similar to what we would expect for a sphere. You have some some rings that are higher intensity near the center, near the forward scattering, and then less intensity as you go further out. But as was nicely shown in the previous talk, when you have a particle that has a more complex morphology, then this light scattering pattern won't be so simple, and it will change as a function of the angle between the incident light, the particle, and your detector. So we would like to be able to isolate our particle, change the orientation, and study how the light scattering signal changes. Okay. So the way that we isolate particles in Yang-Loi Pan's lab is using optical trapping forces. There is another way to do it using electrostatic forces, and in that technique you charge the particle and you put it in an electromagnetic field. But the reason that we choose optical trapping is that with the electromagnetic trapping you have a limited range of techniques to use to manipulate the particle. So optical trapping, there is a lot of different configurations that you can use depending on the size of the particle and the type of particle, whether it's absorbing or non-absorbing. And there's also a lot of different techniques that have been tried to manipulate particles. So the optical trapping forces consist of two main forces. You have radiation pressure forces and the photophoretic force. They both have a radial and a axial component. So for the radiation pressure force, what's happening is that the incoming photons are actually transferring momentum from the photons to the particle. So then you can use that to counteract gravity for small particles. And so the other force that is comes out of radiation pressure is the gradient force, and that pushes your particle towards the more intense spot in the beam. So you have a force pushing up and a force pushing inward. And then the photophoretic forces have to do with the distribution of the heat in the particle. So in the center, you have it's showing a strongly absorbing particle and a weakly absorbing particle, and the heat will tend to deposit onto a different portion of the particle depending on whether it's strongly absorbing or weakly absorbing, which changes the direction in which this force pushes the particle. And then you also have forces that are a result of how the heat distributes around the surface. So we have to make sure that one, these forces are properly balanced to counteract gravity to levitate the particle. And then two, we have to make sure that the horizontal forces are in balance, and that also you can have things like the currents in the air will disturb your particle. And so it's a balancing game. And then here I have a picture of a particle being levitated in our actual setup. Okay. Now, we tried a couple of different methods for actually doing the manipulation of the particle before settling on one that worked. There's been many different methods tried, but not many methods have been tried in air. Most of the methods for manipulating particles have been done in liquid. So you have a bunch of different conditions that determine which method you might like to use. So one is whether the medium's a liquid or a vacuum, and in liquid you have drag forces to deal with. And in some cases you want that because you're trying to measure the forces. And then you can do air or vacuum, and then there's different types of motions you can do, so circular or spinning motion. And then there's different types of amounts of control. So some of these will result in a periodic motion, and you can change the period, but you can't say stop the particle for analysis or change the direction of the particle. And some of these methods are more active. So for circularly or elliptically polarized light, you can do this in liquid or air, and you can rotate the particle this way, but this typically causes a periodic motion. Dual focused beams have been used, and that does result in active control, but this has been only done in liquid. Optical fibers have been used, and then one thing that we tried is shaped beams, including the computer-generated holographic, but we found that with all the optics you need for the CGH, it's hard to keep enough laser power to trap very weakly absorbing particles. And then the last thing is the cylindrical lens, where you can trap in either liquid or air. You can generate either circular or spin motion, and we can actually actively control the direction and speed of the particle. So this is what we settled on using. Okay. This is a schematic of our trapping setup. So we are using a visible laser beam at 532 nanometers. We put it through some optics to clean up the beam and focus it. And then we put it through 2 axicons. And what that does is it generates a hollow beam. And then a mirror reflects that beam up through a cylindrical lens and then up through an aspheric lens. The aspheric lens takes the circular beam and focuses it into a cone, as you can see here. And then this is just a cross section of that cone. And then what the cylindrical lens does is cylindrical lenses focus light into a line rather than a point. So we can create an ellipse rather than a ring. And what this does is it means that the horizontal forces on the particle on one axis versus the other axis are stronger versus another. And using that, we're able to generate a torque on the particle as we spin the cylindrical lens around using this motorized rotation stage. Okay. So after trying this, we made a couple of interesting observations. One was that at higher laser power, our particles tended to undergo circular motion, and then as we lowered the laser power, the motion starts to become more rotational, but we have a lot of jumps, and then if you lower even further, you get a more smooth rotational motion with a tighter radius of motion. So on the top panel here, we're showing a particle that's undergoing a circular motion. So when you if you look at the white crosses here, that's sort of the approximate center of motion. So you can see that the particle is going around this center in a circular pattern. And then on the bottom here at lower laser power, this is a different particle, but it's roughly the same size and it's the same composition. This is a JSC Mars analog, which is made of plagonite. You see that at lower laser power, we're able to get a rotational motion. So this starts out at 0 degrees, and then here you can see it's at roughly 90 degrees, and then it rotates back around to 0 degrees. Okay. And now for the fun part, we have some videos. So this is just demonstrating that we are able to control the speed of our particles. And I have sped up the videos just so that we don't spend forever on them. They're sped up about 5 times, but this is collected for a particle going about 8 degrees per second, and then there'll be a few seconds here at the beginning just to show that we have our particle stably trapped, and then it goes around. And as the cylindrical lens goes around, the particle follows the motion of the cylindrical lens. And for this particle, we're able to go through several cycles of this rotation. And you'll notice as the particle comes to the top here, this is another interesting observation. We also notice that there is some motion in the z-axis along the trapping beam axis. So as the particle rotates around, because of its 3D shape, you must get some points at which the forces balance better if the particle moves slightly in that direction. And then in our next video, we're showing that we can both stop the particle at certain points and then change the direction. So we rotate the particle 90 degrees and then pause, and then another 90 degrees, and then it pauses, and then we can rotate back in the other direction. Like that. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, this ability is really useful because we would like to be able to make these 2D scattering measurements for the same particle at different orientations. And this is an example of that. So I have, this is an agglomeration of carbon nanotubes, and it has this very funky shape. So we have 45 degrees, 135, 225, and 315. So you can see the different orientations here. And then here's our 2D scattering pattern. So in the middle here, we have a mirror that blocks the light. So we have in addition to the 532 nanometer trapping laser, we also have a red laser to do the illumination of the particle. And so the red laser is oriented horizontal relative to the sample chamber that I showed. And then the light hits the particle, and then we have a small mirror that's oriented at 45 degrees to block the really strong forward scattering, and then that takes that light and points it upward so that we can image the scattering angles. So you can see here that as we rotate this particle, this signal changes. Okay. So in summary, we developed a novel method for actively controlling circular and/or spin rotational motion of an optically trapped airborne microparticle. And we showed examples of the circular and spin rotational movement as a function of laser power and the rotation rate of the cylindrical lens. We demonstrated how oriented elastic scattering measurements can be collected using this controlled rotation technique. And we plan to collect measurements of particles with controlled shapes and sizes to compare with 2D elastic scattering computations. And a collaborator has actually provided us some manufactured particles, so they're polystyrene ellipses. So what I'm working on right now is trying to trap those and use this technique to measure the scattering from those at different orientations. And since it is such a well-defined shape, we hope then to be able to do some calculations and compare the two. And then I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the chance to talk about my work. And then I would also like to thank my funding sources, the NRC and DITRA, and thank ARL for hosting me. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Jessica, for a very interesting presentation. As always, please put your questions in the chat or raise your hand. I'll start off. From the some of the points you had on your last slide, I was wondering if you're able to, or if you're planning to take these measurements forward to kind of supply parameters typically required in climate models to diagnose the radiative effect of dust, so such as the single scattering albedo, mass extinction coefficient, etc., which there's a lot of disagreement and uncertainty about whether non-spherical dust particles substantially change these parameters for the radiative effect of dust or not. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, we don't have any plans to do that right now. My main focus is trying to see if we can use the scattering to back out the morphology. So there's actually a program that was written by a previous postdoctoral researcher at ARL that uses a machine learning method to try and discriminate the light scattering signals. So my plan is to feed these measurements into that and see if we can back out the shape.
Okay, thank you. If you have any other questions, please go ahead. Okay, I don't see any other questions.
There is a question, I think, from the audience.
Oh, okay, go ahead and take it.
I have a question about the size. Is there a maximum size that you can trap?
Yeah, so the largest particle that I've been able to trap is around 70 microns, and the smallest is around 5.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Anything else? All right.
Thank you very much again in that case, Jessica, great talk. And we shall move on to our final presentation of the session, which is a poster presentation by Benedetto De Rosa, who will be telling us about determination of Saharan properties, dust properties observed in Potenza with the multi-wavelength Raman LiDAR.
Hello everybody, I am Benedetto De Rosa and today I talk about the determination of Saharan dust properties observed in Potenza by the multi-wavelength Raman LiDAR Museum. Dust is one of the main components of the atmospheric aerosols loading and represent about 75% of the global atmospheric aerosol. The main source is the Saharan Desert. Often Saharan dust particles can cross the Mediterranean Sea and reach the south of Europe. They can impact climate, precipitation cycle, and human health, and have a direct and indirect effects on the radiation budget. A case of the uncertainty of the influence of the mineral aerosols on radiative forcing is the high variability both in time and space of dust concentration, shape, and vertical distribution. LiDAR technique has the strong capability of providing high-quality information about the vertical distribution of the particle in the atmosphere. Located in Potenza, in the middle of the Mediterranean region, the CNR-IMA Atmospheric Observatory represents an ideal location to observe different aerosol species under different meteorological conditions. MUSA is a mobile multi-wavelength LiDAR system based on Nd:YAG laser. Perform measurement of extinction coefficient, backscattering coefficient, LiDAR ratio, particle and volume depolarization, and angstrom exponent. It is one of the reference system of EarlyNet Actris and is used in the CAMS 21B project. The Simel sun photometer of Chao is operational within EarlyNet and performs measures of atmospheric aerosols columnar properties. So, during the 2021 summer, the south of Italy was affected by significant intrusion of Saharan dust. We can see the AOD measurements made with the sun photometer in June, July, and August. In many days, the values of AOD exceeded 0.5. On the right are shown the color map of cross signal performed by MUSA. The days are 21 June, 12 July, and 2 August. In all cases, the maps show a dust intrusion below 5 km. So, the case of study is 12 July 2021. In this case, the analysis of the back trajectories reveal that air masses start from North Africa, crossed the Mediterranean Sea, and arrived on the Missouri site of Potenza. The analysis of optical properties provide important information about the concentration and the typing of the aerosols. In particular, in this case, that we have Saharan dust, the irregular shape and the large size produce high value of the depolarization and medium values of the LiDAR ratio. So, in conclusion, we can say that the LiDAR technique is fundamental for the characterization of dust aerosols and for understanding their impact on the Earth climate. In the next year, the assimilation of LiDAR data from networks like Actris and satellites like Healthcare will be important to improve the model skills. Also, in the future, high-resolution LiDAR data in real time and in near real time will be essential to deal extreme events and in particular to mitigate their effect within future aviation crises. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks for a nice poster talk, Benedetto. A quick question for me to start the questions. Do you plan any further exploration of the summer 2021 dust events at Potenza? And if so, what?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes. Do you plan any more investigation of the dust properties from summer 2021 at Potenza? And
Yes.
if so, what will you look at?
Yes, we have a lot of idea about this case, and is probably to make an inversion for have the microphysical properties from the LiDAR data. So effective radius and size distribution in for this case.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. Any other questions for Benedetto? Okay, I am not seeing any more questions. So in that case, this marks the end of this session. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attention, and wish you enjoyment of the rest of the day and the remainder of the conference. And thanks very much again to all the speakers who presented some excellent and very interesting results today. Thank you.